Emma Thompson lived with her mother Rose in a small cottage on Maple Street in the quiet English village of Willowbrook. The two women had always shared a special bond that grew even stronger after Emma's father died in a car accident when she was only 7 years old. Now, at 26, Emma worked as a teacher at the local primary school, while her 52-year-old mother Rose spent her days baking fresh bread and sweet pastries at Mill. As bakery on the village square. Rose was known throughout Willowbrook for her kindness and gentle nature. She always had a warm word for the children who stopped by the bakery after school, and she never forgot to ask the elderly customers about their health or their grandchildren. Emma often watched her mother with admiration, wondering how someone could remain so positive and caring after losing her husband so young and raising a daughter all by herself. The autumn of 2023 brought an unusual chill to their small village. The leaves turned golden earlier than usual, and Rose began complaining of feeling tired more often than normal. She would come home from the bakery and sit quietly in her favorite armchair by the window, staring out at the garden with a distant look in her eyes. Emma noticed that her mother seemed to be carrying some invisible weight on her shoulders, but whenever she asked about it, Rose would simply smile and say she was fine. One particularly grey morning in October, Emma decided to help her mother organize the upstairs bedroom. Rose had been putting off this task for months, claiming she didn't have the energy to go through all the old boxes and furniture that had accumulated over the years. Emma knew her mother needed help, even if she was too proud to ask for it. They started early. Just after breakfast, Rose made them both cups of tea, and they carried them upstairs along with some biscuits she had brought home from the bakery the night before. The bedroom was filled with sunlight streaming through the lace curtains, and Emma felt hopeful that this would be a pleasant day of sharing memories and stories about their family's past. The old wooden wardrobe stood against the far wall like a giant guardian of forgotten treasures. It had belonged to Emma's grandmother and was filled with clothes that Rose hadn't worn in years, old blankets, and several mysterious boxes that Emma had never seen opened. Rose seemed hesitant as they approached the wardrobe, but she nodded when Emma suggested they start their daughters. They began removing items from the wardrobe. Emma discovered a heavy wooden box tucked away in the very back corner, hidden behind a pile of winter coats. The box was made of dark wood and had a small brass latch that looked tarnished with age. When Emma lifted it, she could hear something moving round inside, like papers or small objects shifting about. Rose was busy folding an old dress when Emma asked about the contents of the box. The moment Rose looked up and saw what Emma was holding, her face changed completely. All the color drained from her cheeks, and her hands began to tremble slightly. She quickly looked away and tried to sound casual when she told Emma it was nothing important, but her voice was shaky and uncertain. Emma's curiosity was too strong to ignore. She had never seen her mother react this way to anything before. Rose had always been open about their family history, sharing stories about Emma's father and grandparents whenever Emma asked. This sudden secrecy was completely out of character for her normally transparent mother. The brass latch opened easily, and inside the box Emma found a collection of old letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, some small pieces of jewelry, and what appeared to be official documents. But it was the photograph that caught her attention immediately. It was a small black and white picture of a baby, probably only a few weeks old. The infant in the photograph had the most beautiful green eyes Emma had ever seen, exactly like her mother's eyes. And there was something about the shape of the face that reminded Emma of the baby pictures she had seen of herself. Emma's hands were shaking as she turned the photograph over. Written in her mother's familiar handwriting were the words that would change everything she thought she knew about her family. The ink was faded but still clearly readable. Someone named James had been important enough for her mother to keep. His picture all these years, and the apology written on the back suggested some kind of deep regret or sorrow. When Emma looked up at her mother with the photograph in her hands, she saw a woman she barely recognized. Rose had always been strong and composed, even during the most difficult times after Emma's father died. But now she looked fragile and broken, as if this one small photograph had the power to destroy her completely. The silence in the room felt heavy and uncomfortable. Emma had so many questions racing through her mind, but something about her mother's expression told her that whatever story lay behind this photograph, it was going to be painful for both of them to hear. The discovery of the baby photograph changed everything in the small cottage on Maple Street. For 3 long days after Emma found the picture of James, Rose moved through their home like a ghost. She would wake up early in the morning and sit by the kitchen window with a cup of tea that grew cold in her hands, staring out at nothing. When Emma tried to start conversations, Rose would nod and smile, but her answers were short and distant. Emma watched her mother carefully during those difficult days. Rose had always been a woman who took care of everyone round her, but now she seemed to have forgotten how to take care of herself. She barely touched her food at dinner time, pushing the vegetables round her plate without eating them at night. Emma could hear her mother walking round the house, her footsteps creaking on the old wooden floors as she moved from room to room, and all to sleep. The bakery where Rose worked began to notice the change too. Mrs. Miller, the owner, called Emma at the school to ask if Rose was feeling unwell. She explained that Rose had been making mistakes with the bread recipes and had burned a whole batch of scones on Tuesday morning. This was completely unlike Rose, who had been baking perfectly for 15 years without any problems. Emma knew that her mother was struggling with the weight of keeping this secret for so many years. Every time Emma looked at her, she could see the pain in Rose's green eyes, the same eyes that belonged to the baby in the photograph. Emma wanted to ask more questions about James, but she could see that her mother was already carrying too much sadness to handle any more difficult conversations on Sunday evening, after they had both spent a quiet day reading and trying to act normal. Rose finally made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. She put the kettle on the stove and took out their best china cups, the ones with tiny pink roses that had belonged to Emma's grandmother. Her hands were shaking as she arranged everything on a small wooden tray with some biscuits from the bakery. Emma could sense that something important was about to happen. Rose never used the good china unless it was Christmas or someone's birthday. They sat down at their small kitchen table, the same table where they had shared thousands of meals and conversations over the years. The evening light was coming through the window, making everything look golden and peaceful, but Emma could feel tension in the air. Rose took a deep breath and began to speak in a voice that was barely above a whisper. She told Emma that she had carried this secret for 28 years, and that the weight of it was making her sick. She explained that before Emma was born, there had been another child, a son named James who would have been Emma's older brother. When Emma heard these words, she felt as if the world had suddenly stopped moving. She had always been an only child, and she had often wondered what it would be like to have brothers or sisters. She had asked her parents about it when she was younger, but they always said they were happy with their perfect little family of 3. Now she was learning that there had been a 4th member of their family, someone she had never known existed. Rose continued her story with tears streaming down her face. She explained that James had been born when she and Emma's father were very young, barely out of their teenagers. They were living in a different town then, renting a small apartment above a grocery store. When James was born, they thought they were the luckiest people in the world. But within days the doctors discovered that something was wrong with his tiny heart. The medical team at the hospital tried to explain the problem to Rose and her husband, but they were so young and scared that they could barely understand what the doctors were telling them. All they knew was that their beautiful baby boy was very sick and might not live for a very long. They spent every possible moment at the hospital, taking turns holding James and singing lullabies to him, hoping that their love would somehow make him stronger. Emma listened to her mother's story with tears in her own eyes. She could imagine how terrifying it must have been for her parents to face such a terrible situation when they were so young. She reached across the table and took her mother's hand, feeling how cold and thin it was. Rose had always been the strong one in their family, but now Emma could see that her mother had been carrying an enormous burden of grief for most of her adult life. Rose explained that after James died, she and Emma's father were so heartbroken that they could barely function. They decided to move to Willowbrook to start fresh, hoping that a change of scenery would help them heal. When Emma was born 2 years later, she brought happiness back into their lives. But Rose had been so afraid of losing another child that she became overprotective and never spoke about James again. After learning the truth about James, Emma felt as if her entire world had been turned upside down. She walked through the days following her mother's revelation in a strange fog of emotions that she wouldn't quite understand or control. At work, she found herself staring out the classroom window while her young students practiced their reading, her mind wandering to thoughts of a brother she would never meet. The children noticed that their usually cheerful teacher seemed sad and distracted, and some of them asked if she was feeling sick. Emma's emotions were a confusing mixture of grief, anger, and deep sadness. She grieved for James, a brother she had never known existed until a few days ago. She felt angry at her mother for keeping such an important secret from her for 26 years of her life. But most of all, she felt confused about how to process this information and what it meant for her relationship with Rose. Every evening when Emma came home from school, she would find her mother waiting anxiously in the kitchen or sitting in her favorite chair by the window. Rose had prepared Emma's favorite meals each night, hoping to start a conversation and begin healing the distance that had grown between them. She made shepherd's pie with extra vegetables, just the way Emma liked it. She baked fresh apple tart with cinnamon, the dessert that always made Emma smile. But Emma barely touched the food, eating only a few bites before excusing herself and going upstairs to her bedroom. Rose watched her daughter retreat into silence with a breaking heart. She had spent 28 years protecting Emma from the pain of losing James, but now she realized that her decision to keep the secret might have caused even more hurt. She wanted to explain her reasons and help Emma understand, but every time she tried to start a conversation, Emma would give short answers and look away for 5 long days. The cottage on Maple Street felt cold and uncomfortable. Despite the warm autumn weather outside, Emma and Rose moved round each other carefully. Like strangers sharing the same space, they said good morning and good evening. But the easy conversations and laughter that had always filled their home were completely gone. On the 5th evening, Emma decided to look through the old photo albums that were kept on the bookshelf in the living room. She had seen these pictures hundreds of times before, but now she was looking at them with completely different eyes. She wanted to see if there were any signs of James or clues about the secret that her mother had been keeping for so many years. As Emma studied the photographs more carefully, she began to notice things that she had never seen before. In the pictures from when she was a tiny baby, her mother's smile looked forced and artificial. Rose was holding Emma in every photograph, but her grip looked tight and desperate, as if she was afraid that Emma might disappear if she let go for even a moment. In some pictures, Emma could see that her mother's eyes were red and puffy, as if she had been crying before the photograph was taken. Emma found pictures of her first birthday party, her first day of school, and family holidays. But in all of them she could now see the hidden sadness in her mother's face. Rose had been trying so hard to be a good mother and to create happy memories for Emma. But the grief for James had been there all along, just beneath the surface of every smile. As Emma continued looking through the albums, she began to understand something important about her mother's behavior throughout her childhood. Rose had always been extremely protective of Emma, sometimes to the point where it had seemed excessive. When Emma had even the smallest cold or fever, Rose would stay home from work and watch over her constantly. When Emma wanted to ride her bicycle or climb trees with her friends, Rose would worry and ask her to be extra careful. Emma had sometimes felt frustrated by her mother's overprotective nature, especially when she was a teenager and wanted more independence. But now she realized that Rose's constant worry came from a place of deep love and terrible fear. Rose had already lost one child, and the thought of losing Emma too must have been unbearable. The next morning, Emma woke up earlier than usual and went downstairs to make breakfast. She found her mother already sitting at the kitchen table with the same wooden box that had started this whole discovery. Rose's eyes were red and swollen from crying, and she looked as if she hadn't slept at all during the night. When she saw Emma, she took a deep breath and spoke in a voice that was quiet but determined. Rose opened the wooden box slowly and began taking out items that Emma had never seen before. There were tiny baby clothes in soft blue and white colors, so small that they would have fit a doll. There was a hospital bracelet made of plastic with James William Thompson written in black letter. Yes, along with a date from 28 years ago. Emma could see several more photographs of James, some showing him with her parents when they were much younger. After several days of looking through the photographs and baby items that Rose had kept hidden for so many years, Emma made a decision that surprised even herself. She wanted to visit James's grave and see the place where her brother was buried. The idea came to her suddenly one morning while she was drinking her tea and watching her mother tend to the small garden behind their cottage. Emma had never visited a cemetery before, except for her father's funeral when she was very young, and she wasn't sure what to expect. But something deep inside her felt that she needed to see James's resting place with her own eyes. She needed to make this connection with the brother she had never known, and she felt that visiting his grave might help both her and her mother begin to heal from all the years of hidden grief. When Emma mentioned her idea to Rose, her mother's reaction was immediate and fearful. Rose had been to James's grave only once, on the day of his funeral 28 years ago. Since then, she had been too afraid to return, worried that seeing his headstone would bring back all the terrible pain and sadness that had nearly destroyed her in those dark months after his death. Rose sat on their old sofa with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. She explained to Emma that the cemetery was in Millfield, the town where they had lived when James was born and where he had spent his brief 6 weeks of life. It was about 2 hours away by car, and Rose admitted that she had avoided even driving through that town for nearly 3 decades because the memories were too painful. Emma could see how frightened her mother was at the thought of returning to that place. Rose's hands were trembling slightly, and her voice was shaky as she spoke about her fears. She worried that she wouldn't be strong enough to handle seeing James's grave after all these years. She was afraid that the visit might bring back the depression and hopelessness that had consumed her after James died. But Emma was determined to make this journey, and she gently insisted that they should go together. She told her mother that carrying this burden alone for 28 years had been far too long, and that it was time for both of them to face this difficult part of their family's history. Emma promised Rose that she would be there to support her every step of the way, and that they could leave whenever Rose felt it was too much to handle. The following Saturday morning dawned grey and cloudy, which seemed appropriate for their solemn journey. Emma packed a small bag with tissues, bottled water, and some sandwiches in case they needed to stop for a break along the way. She had borrowed a car from her friend at school. Since neither she nor Rose owned a vehicle, they rarely needed one in their small village, where everything was within walking distance. Rose was unusually quiet as they began their drive to Millfield. She sat in the passenger seat looking out at the countryside rolling past the windows, her hands folded in her lap and her face pale with anxiety. Emma tried to make gentle conversation about the scenery and the weather, but Rose was too nervous to respond with more than short answers as they got closer to their destination. Emma could see that her mother was becoming more and more tense. Rose had lived in Millfield for only 2 years, but it was where some of the most important and devastating events of her life had taken place. It was where she had been young and hopeful, where James had been born, where she had experienced both the greatest joy and the deepest sorrow of her life. The cemetery was located on the outskirts of Millfield, surrounded by tall oak trees that had grown much larger in the past 28 years. The grounds were well maintained, with neatly trimmed grass pathways winding between sections of headstones. Emma could see that it was a peaceful place, the kind of location that would provide comfort to families who came to visit their loved ones. Finding James's grave proved to be more difficult than they had expected. The cemetery was larger than it had seemed from the entrance, and Rose's memory of the exact location was fuzzy after so many years. They walked slowly along the pathways, reading names and dates on headstones, searching for the section where babies and young children were buried. Finally, in a quiet corner of the cemetery beneath a large oak tree, they found a small headstone with James's name carved into the grey stone. Emma felt her heart break a little when she saw how small and simple it was, and how forgotten it looked after nearly 3 decades without visitors. The headstone was covered with moss and fallen leaves, and there were no flowers or other signs that anyone had been there in recent years. Emmy immediately knelt down on the damp grass and began cleaning the headstone with tissues from her purse, gently removing the moss and dirt so that James's name and dates could be clearly seen. Rose stood behind her daughter, tears streaming down her face as she looked at her son's grave for the first time in 28 years. The visit to James's grave marked the beginning of a beautiful transformation in the small cottage on Maple Street. In the weeks and months that followed, Emma and Rose discovered that talking about James didn't bring only sadness, but also brought them closer together in ways they had never expected. The secret that had once felt like a heavy wall between them became a bridge that connected their hearts more deeply than ever before. Rose began sharing stories about James that she had kept locked away in her memory for 28 years. She told Emma about how James loved to be sung to, especially old lullabies that Rose's own mother had sung to her when she was a child. She described how his tiny fingers would curl round hers with surprising strength, and how his green eyes would seem to focus on her face when she spoke to him softly. Rose remembered how peaceful James looked when he slept, and how he would make little cooing sounds that filled her heart with joy as Emma listened to these precious memories. She began to understand something important about her own childhood. She realized that James had never really been hidden from her life at all. His love and memory had been present in every day of her upbringing, woven into the way Rose had cared for her with such extraordinary tenderness and devotion. Emma now understood why her mother had always been so protective and loving. All those times when Rose had stayed up all night when Emma had a fever, holding cool cloths to her forehead and checking her temperature every hour. All those moments when Rose had held Emma's hand extra tightly when they crossed busy streets, as if she was afraid to let go even for a second. All those bedtime routines when Rose would tell Emma, "I love you" 3 times before turning off the light, making sure the words were said with perfect sincerity each time. Emma realized that every act of extra care and attention from her mother had been influenced by the love Rose still carried for James. Rose had raised Emma with the knowledge that children are precious and fragile, and that every healthy day is a gift that should never be taken for granted. In a way, James's brief life had made Emma's childhood richer and more filled with love, even though she hadn't known it at the time. The two women decided to create a special memory book that would honor James and help them preserve all the stories and feelings they were sharing. Emma bought a beautiful album with blank pages, and they spent many evenings sitting together at the kitchen table, writing down Rose's memories in careful handwriting. They included all the photographs that Rose had saved, along with copies of James's hospital bracelet and other keepsakes that had been hidden in the wooden box for so many years. Emma also brought her camera on their monthly visits to the cemetery, and they added new photographs to the memory book showing the flowers they planted round James's headstone and the way the seasons changed round his grave. These new pictures became some of Emma's favorites because they showed her and her mother together, finally able to visit James as a complete family. Rose's personality began to change in wonderful ways as she allowed herself to talk about James openly. She started smiling more easily and seemed to carry herself with less of the hidden sadness that Emma now realized had always been there. Rose began baking a special type of ginger biscuit that she had craved when she was pregnant with James, and she would bring batches of them to share with their neighbors and the customers at Miller's. Bakery. One of the most important changes in Rose's life came when she decided to join a support group for parents who had lost children. The group met once a week in the community center, and Rose was nervous about attending the first meeting. But she quickly discovered that being able to talk about James with other parents who understood her pain was incredibly healing. For the first time in 28 years, she could speak her son's name without feeling ashamed or afraid. As spring arrived in Willowbrook, Emma decided to surprise her mother with a special gift that would honor James's memory in their own home. She had been secretly working in their backyard, preparing the soil and planning a small garden that would be dedicated to her brother. She chose white roses because they symbolize pure love, and forget-me-nots because their names seemed perfect for keeping James's memory alive. On a beautiful morning in April, Emma led her mother outside to see the surprise. She had also made a small wooden sign with James's name and the words "Forever in Our Hearts" carved into it. When Rose saw the garden, she began to cry tears of happiness and gratitude. She knelt down to touch the soft petals of the flowers and said that James would have loved having a garden, and that he would have wanted to help them plant everything if he had been able to grow up with them. Emma hugged her mother tightly and told her that James had helped them in his own special way, by bringing them closer together and teaching them to appreciate the love they shared. The garden became a place where they could sit quietly and remember James, and where they could feel his presence in their daily lives. The end.